everyone. You're here at the YANA webinar series on careers in social impact. Today is the fourth one in our career series, pivoting your career from the private sector to the public sector or social impact sector. If you're interested in viewing any of the earlier ones we did, which is starting out or going abroad and a few other topics, they're all archived on our YouTube channel, and then we'll have at least another one or two about later stages in social impact careers. Just to be clear, today's program is designed for those who are thinking of pivoting their careers from the private sector to one that is more mission-driven. And remember that not everyone in the social impact sector started in the field. In fact, many of us made conscious choices to pivot our careers from the private sector to the public sector, as I did from structured finance law, and many people I know. Others transitioned through serendipity, and some were just dipping their toes in the water. So today we want to focus on the why, the how, and with what skills, at least for us, some Yale alumni and those they have worked with, have made the transition from private sector to nonprofits and more full-time social impact work. So we have with us one of our board members, Marilyn Machlowitz, welcome, who is a Princeton undergrad and a PhD from Yale. She recently joined the YANA board. She worked first in corporate executive search, and then I guess almost 25 years ago, started and ran her own executive search firm, serving noted nonprofits and foundations. She is a wealth of knowledge, and we're delighted to have her here. We also have with us Ken Inadomi, class of 76 from Yale, also Stanford Business School. He is the founding chair and president of YANA. He's also the former co-chair of Project Redwood, which is a social philanthropy fund managed by alumni from the Stanford Business School. And Ken, too, worked in the private sector for almost 30 years before switching over to the public sector. We're delighted that he did. He also currently serves as the executive director of NYPACE, which is the New York Professional Advisors for Community Entrepreneurs, a nonprofit that provides pro bono business consulting to entrepreneurs of color in New York and Chicago. And thanks for joining us, Ken. And we also have Matt Gerken, class of 2011, based in Chicago with American Philanthropic, which is a really great development strategy, assessment, fundraising services for nonprofits. They have terrific blogs and information out of Chicago, and I'm just delighted we've tapped into Matt before. I'm really glad to have him join us for this program. Matt began his career in Teach for America, teaching world history to sophomores in South Texas. And he's also worked as a program director for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to let our audience members know that I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat function. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. If it's directly to a panelist, you can ask them and we'll try to answer them. But we'll just get started. We want to make this informative, but also if those of you who have very specific questions related to your own situation, feel free to ask them. So Ken, I want to get started with you. Let's talk a little bit how you made the transition, including what prompted you to start YANA. Was it like this slow, methodical thing? Was it more of an aha movement? And tell us a little bit about your path.
Sure, great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to our fellow panelists, Matt and Marilyn. Real pleasure to be with you. So Rachel, you mentioned that the move from the private sector to nonprofit, sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's serendipity. For me, I think of it almost as an angel intervention. And here's where I'm coming from. Take us back to 2008. It's about 13 years ago. I'm driving back from New Jersey. I'm on Highway 80. At that time, I owned a credit reporting company, CIS. It was one of the largest independent credit reporting companies in the US. We basically did the credit reports, credit scores, property valuations, all of that data that you need to close a residential mortgage. We did all of that online. I'm driving home. I'm on Highway 80. I'm heading back into Manhattan. I've got my favorite satellite radio station on, E Street Radio, Bruce Springsteen 24/7. And I had to get some gas. So I pull off to one of those mini marts. As I was getting gas, I went inside. And I had these cravings, which occasionally kind of surfaced. And I went in, I got a can of Pepsi, I got a pack of pork rinds, and a pack of cigarettes, some Marlboros. So mind you, I'm 53 years old and indulging in these kinds of habits. I go back to the car, I flip on the radio again. And I happen to catch a live concert tape of Springsteen, and he's yelling out his famous war cry, Nobody wins unless everybody wins. And it just kind of stunned me hearing him say that, and the stage of my life at that point, because I looked down in my hands and I realized all the junk that I had, this, this fat, this sugar, this nicotine. And I realized that, that these were replacing a big void that I had in my life. I felt at that point that I had a life of success, but what I really wanted was a life of impact. So it was just kind of one of those private moments. And then about 5 minutes later, I'm back on the road and I get a call from the office, and they had just received an email that there was an internet posting for an opening for executive director of an affordable housing agency in New York. And the note was, ask Ken if he knows anyone that might be interested in applying for this. So I said, let me call you back. So for the rest of the ride home, I didn't touch anything. I did have a sip of the Pepsi, but I didn't touch the cigarettes or the pork rinds. And long story short is the next day I applied for this position. It turns out that I was the only one from the private sector that applied. But remember, this is 2008, which was the height of the mortgage meltdown. There was a foreclosure wave throughout the nation, especially hitting people of color. I said, that great saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. In my case, the opportunity will appear. And then that other great question, which always floats through my mind, if not now, when? So I went for it. It turns out that the search committee was actually looking for someone. They were looking at this as a turnaround situation. So coming from the private sector, having run businesses, they felt that I had the qualities that would really fit right into what that executive directorship needed. So that was in 2008. I stayed for 7 years. It was a wonderful experience. We're still in touch with the people from that agency, the New York Mortgage Coalition, which focuses on first-time home ownership for low and moderate income families. So again, it wasn't deliberate, it wasn't intentional, but my mind was open. The opportunity presented itself, and I went for it. So maybe I'll stop there and then we'll hear the others.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And just what's the timing of when you started YANA during
okay.
that?
So actually, that's a key point. So the epiphany happened in 2008. The kind of the rumblings for YANA started really when I started in nonprofit, because I realized I was in over my head. You can be an expert in the private sector, but once you get into nonprofit, it's different culture, it's different values, the staff is different. I mean, I was 53 years old then. The staff in that office, because we shared an office with another nonprofit, I think the average age must have been maybe mid-30s. So I'm with a millennial staff. I'm the oldest guy there, but I was never been with more dedicated or smarter people. But I knew I was in over my head. I needed to know more about nonprofit, how it worked. So I reached out to the Yale Alumni Network and I asked, is there an association, a group of Yale alums that are somehow involved in social impact or nonprofit? They said no. Mark Dahlhoff, the legendary leader of the AYA then, he said, Ken, why don't you start something? So long story short is a group of us got together. We met on a cold, snowy night in January 2011 at the Yale Club, and YANA was born. We didn't even have a name yet. But through some of the great alums like Kathy Edersheim and Ted Smith, Frank Raphael, who were at that first meeting, we created the structure and the design, and we mapped out a blueprint for what eventually evolved into YANA.
Well, we're glad you made those inquiries, and I know when I called, when I moved up to New England and I was kind of transitioning, I did the same thing. I heard there was YANA. I went to some event and then I called you. I said, hey, Ken, is there a network up here in New England? They said, no, but there's another guy in Boston. Why don't you guys go start something? So we did. So you clearly tapped into a need. I mean, you obviously fulfilled your own, but obviously we still find people, alumni in our network for whom this is like a major network. So thank you for starting. And I'm sure we'll get back to you with a few other questions. Great. Matt, I wanted to turn to you because you started your career with TFA and now you're at a private firm, but you're working for and with nonprofits. So can you tell us a little bit what your career is like and kind of how you meandered to where you are now?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, for having me. And thanks, Marilyn and Ken. It's a real honor to be here today with you and with all of our participants. So I suppose I had less of a clean break into the nonprofit world than Ken, perhaps. I started out at Teach for America, where, I was a school employee, but I was, Teach for America is obviously this very large nonprofit context. And then I went to work at a nonprofit for a couple of years. And then I sort of fell into my current company, where we are a for-profit company, but we exclusively help philanthropies and nonprofits. So I've kind of been standing at this intersection for a while, and really more so than my own story, observing other people go through this transition, some very happily and successfully like Ken, and some not so happily and not so successfully. And I've had to give a lot of thought through the years in this role, and in what are those factors that make it go well for some people and not for others. And so I think, what I've seen in our work as a company is that there are advantages and disadvantages on both sides of the aisle, really. And it helps if you're thinking about a transition like this, to be very clear-eyed about what those are. It is not all happiness on the nonprofit side when you get there, just because you are more inspired by the mission of an organization you might serve compared to a previous corporate role. Sometimes that can actually leave people more frustrated, right? Because they feel that the things they aren't able to do, or the things they aren't able to achieve, are a much bigger deal, honestly, in some cases on the nonprofit side than what you might feel in a for-profit setting. And so I have many thoughts about that, but yeah, that's my general story. Is I kind of sit now at this intersection between the two. I see people go back and forth. We do some personnel searches like Marilyn does, and just work with a lot of nonprofit leaders, and some of them, come from the nonprofit world, or from the for-profit world, excuse me, and they're frustrated by what they find in the nonprofit world, and others adapt really well and are able to transfer over and translate those experiences and do something really unique for a cause that they care about. But I'm always interested in those differences. Why does it go one way or the other?
Good. Okay, cool. Thanks for sharing. Marilyn, I want to turn to you. With a psychology PhD from Yale, I would have thought you might have gone into your own academic or private therapy practice or something, but you ended up going into private executive search, and then did your own. So tell us a little bit about what you did and
sure.
Across in your own practice.
Thank you, Rachel. And I so enjoy hearing what Ken and Matt have had to say so far. I was one of those naive graduate students. I did not know I was supposed to want to become an academic after getting a PhD. It happens. What can I tell you? And I always was interested in the psychology of work, psychology of careers. So I knew that was where I was going to find myself. I managed to turn my dissertation into a popular book. The title was Workaholics. This is a long time ago. And these were workaholics without email, for instance, just to give you, or cell phones, just to give you an, for instance. And then I went my way into human resources, eventually to search. When I started my own firm about 24 years ago, I was still working with for-profit clients. I like to say I was on the wrong side of every merger. So if you're on the wrong side of a merger, you don't have a client sometimes after the merger. In any event, I was introduced to a foundation to do a search there, and my eyes were opened because at that moment, all I knew about foundations was that they were the names that rolled up the credits at the end of something on PBS. That's not a lot of knowledge, I have to tell you. Now, in fact, to my defense, foundations were more mysterious then, and they kept things less transparent than today. So once exposed to what foundations and nonprofits did, I was hooked. I was sold. And I transitioned my practice exclusively to serving foundations and nonprofits. And as you might imagine, and we'll get into this as we pursue this conversation, sometimes that entailed calling up somebody at McKinsey and asking them basically, how would you like to take a 1/2 to 2/3 pay cut? So you can see the job had some challenges, but I loved it, and I retired 2 months ago.
Okay, great. And we're going to get into some of the detail about what you've learned and what you've helped people take that 2/3 pay cut, as many of us have. My salary's definitely gone down over the past 2 decades. So let's start with some of these sort of bigger questions, and any of you can jump in. Let's take a look. What was the biggest barrier that either you in making this transition, Ken, or maybe it's a little more fluid for some of you, or for Marilyn, people you've worked with, to overcome that transition from the public sector to social impact? Matt, you alluded to the fact that there are some people who may have had a little bit of delusion about, it's all mission-driven happiness. I know certainly what it's like to go from a McKinsey to someplace that has, $100,000 budget. It's a little bit different. So biggest barriers you've seen and how people have overcome them.
If I share my perspective on the biggest barrier, I think some of you will be surprised. I think it is the reluctance on the side of the nonprofit employer. And that reluctance is a surprise to the person seeking to make the change. And I think that is part of why making this change is not as easy as we would think and not as quick as some people would hope.
Just to build on that, one of the fundamental differences is, remember, in the private sector, it's about how much money can I make. In the nonprofit sector, it's about how many people can I help. And that is those are such opposites that if someone is suspicious of your values coming in, if you're wearing a for-profit badge and they're going to be suspicious of that, you really have to bend over backward. Now, I will say that, remember, I made the switch back in 2008, 13 years ago. There's been a huge shift now, just socially and in the workforce, of more and more for-profit going over to nonprofit. So in a way, that path is more established, but you still have to prove yourself and to reinforce the fact that you're committed to values that are socially driven, not profit driven.
I think those are, those are both great points. I totally agree with both of them. And I think if you're sitting in the seat of someone thinking about this transition and what it might be like on the other side, one of the ways you need to think about that is, do I have an understanding and do I have the humility to start to understand, if I make this switch, that nonprofits are not just, for-profits where you switch out the money metrics for helping people metrics and everything else is the same. And I did great in the for-profit world, so I know how it's done, and I'll come in and I'll make everything great. Most people are not thinking that fully consciously, but I think I often find some of that buried in people trying to make the transition. And that can actually be very harmful to a nonprofit cause that you care about, because you're not respecting nonprofits as their own sector with their own practices that work, and even for the practices that aren't working, the dysfunctions, there are reasons the dysfunctions are there. And if you can't discover those reasons and dig into them and respect the nonprofit sphere for what it is, you may be able to successfully make the switch, you may get that job, but you're going to be very unhappy in it, and you're going to make the other people who work there very unhappy as well. And I see that sometimes, and it's usually it comes back to some form of not respecting nonprofits as a thing that are different. They're not just, a differently structured for-profit business where every practice translates over well. So for example, my company does a lot of work in fundraising, and a lot of people from the outside, or a lot of board members, well, fundraising is just sales, right? It's just sales, but we're raising money for a cause rather than, purchasing a product. Well, certainly there are some similarities, but a lot of sales practices translate very poorly into fundraising because the psychology of fundraising is completely different. In the other example I would give would be, okay, how do we translate some of those outcomes metrics, those success metrics? Well, in the for-profit world, we have one very big metric that overrides the others. Is the firm profitable? Is my business profitable? Am I growing a business? And oftentimes a sort of surface level translation of that thinking into nonprofits, again, can go very poorly, right? Because even if I start analyzing, I'm working in homelessness, let's say, and I'm trying to help people achieve stable housing, and I decide my overriding metric is how many people I'm getting into more stable situations. Well, that might be good on one hand, but it also might create incentives in your organization for the people on your ground in your program to only help the people who have the least difficult problems to overcome, right? Well, I can serve 1,000 people who are teetering on the edge of homelessness, but to help someone whose problems run deeper, who's going to be a more difficult case, that's going to hurt my metrics. So as a program staff member, I'm going to focus on the people who are just riding on the edge, because that will make my numbers look better, my reviews look better, et cetera. You run into all those sorts of questions when you get into the nonprofit management, and the answers aren't always as clear as you might think they would be, translating your for-profit knowledge.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. And I know we've spoken and had some foundations on our panels, and there's been some pushback back to foundations about what they're asking the metrics to be. So I think there is more thought about that, what you having to have kind of metrics and numbers, and that's not really how things translate. And there's been some reconciling. I think we had Anthony Bug-Levine, I know, and a few others have talked about that. Marilyn, can I get back to you on, you mentioned the barrier, but can you go into a little bit more detail what it is about the reluctance by the
Sure. I think there are a couple of factors. One can be a person, well, let's start with the beginning. In nonprofit, it's very common to have to meet the staff even before you're hired to be their boss, let's say. You meet a wide swath of people, which may or may not have happened in for-profit. So some of them might feel, I spent my whole career in this, and you're going to walk in and be my boss. So that's a little bit reticence and reluctance. Another part is that the for-profit transition candidate might seem to be ill-schooled or slightly less informed than he or she needs to be. So for instance, when a person for-profit uses such phrases as I'd like to give back, or, oh gosh, there's so many, or I'd like to bring business skills to the nonprofit world, those statements have been said so often and heard so often that they read as cliches and not in a favorable way. And I'd say lastly, if there's nothing in the person's resume or experience that connotes that this is more than a passing thought, there's concern that the person won't stay or won't stick. So what shows that it's more than a passing thought? Clearly volunteer work can, clearly board service can, clearly an early job in government or a nonprofit, such as Matt's work at Teach for America, which probably was his very first job, and for many people has been their very first job out of undergraduate. Those things all suggest some seriousness of intent and some knowledge of what it is you're seeking to transition to.
Excellent. We're gonna talk a little bit more about how some details about how you kind of can position yourself. Ken, Erin, did you have anybody else have anything they want to pipe in onto that issue? Because all right, so let's make the transition now to, for those people who are looking, let's get into those. What are the kinds of skills from the private sector to the public sector you found to be useful, either not appreciated, and then you maybe nonprofits now get it, or that people are pushing too much from the, we've talked a little bit about, you know, I do sales, I can do that. So what are the ones that are useful when you, Marilyn, maybe some of the success stories when you've called those McKinsey folks, how's that happened? And Matt, maybe we can start with you again. Started to talk about some of those skills that did translate and some that didn't.
Yeah, I would say depending on your background, some things are easier than others. You know, if you have a specialty in an area of law that is very applicable to nonprofits, that can certainly be helpful and perhaps not as different of a transition as some other folks might experience. I think that marketing and communications work is always beneficial to have some of that knowledge coming over from a larger for-profit. You know, you just have to be careful knowing what you're getting into, because, you know, you're oftentimes to see people go from, you know, a digital marketing role where they've got, you know, a huge 7-figure ad budget, and you get to a nonprofit and it's like, well, whatever you can post on the social media account, and if I can haggle a few $100 in ad spend, that's what you'll get this month. And those can go poorly as well. So yeah, I think there's many different types of skills that can translate if you understand that the translation may be difficult in some ways. I find this is not always the case, but it is often easier to make a transition to the nonprofit sphere either earlier in your career or later in your career, because if you've led a successful company, you're at the tail end of your career, you've proven your management skills and your people skills in developing a larger operation. A board of people who is frankly probably more similar to you than a lot of the nonprofit staff is, often can see the value that you would bring. Similarly, on the front end, if you're in the first 5 years of your career, maybe you've developed some digital marketing skills, for example, and a nonprofit really is in need of that particular role, you may be like a very excellent candidate for that sort of thing. Where I think it is more difficult is in the middle, where you've got 5, 10, 15 years of experience, but the roles that a nonprofit has seen you qualified for are roles where they see, well, this is difficult because this requires some real experience in skills and knowledge specific to the nonprofit environment. And why would I want to hire someone who may be a wonderful person, they may be a great manager, they may be great, in a variety of ways, but we know that they almost certainly don't have the specific, fundraising or marketing or program management skills that I could get from someone else who has a long career in nonprofits at that point. Not always the case, but often that's a trend I see.
Okay, and we'll get in a little bit about how you can start to make that demonstration. I know for me, I was very methodical. It still took me about 5 years of self-education and making concerted effort. So Ken, what did you find? You said you walked in, you had some skills, but you knew you were over your head.
Well, no, I think the way Matt mapped it out is really beautiful. The fact that, so remember, I was at the later stage of my career, and I was able to go in just on the credentials of having been successful in the private sector, and then those are transferable skills because they're looking for someone to turn around an agency during an economic slump. So that was clear. Let's go to the front end, okay? Because I know there have to be a lot of young alums or just young people that are listening in, wondering how to get in. And I always say that, one of the big values of a liberal arts education is it teaches 3 things. All 3 are really valuable for the nonprofit sector. First is it teaches you how to think critically, how to solve problems. Because obviously that's the essence of nonprofits. Something's wrong, it has to be addressed. Second big skill is it teaches in a liberal arts education, hopefully you learn how to work collaboratively. Nonprofit is about teams, usually small teams, but you're going to be interacting. You need the people skills. You really need to learn how to play in the sandbox. And then the third thing, arguably the most important, you have to be able to express yourself both in written form and verbally, in succinctly and in a precise and convincing way. If young people can write, that is such a valuable skill that it goes a long way. The thing we look for all the time when we're hiring right now at NYPACE is the ability to write, because if you can give someone an assignment and they can take it all the way to the finish with just minimal editing, it's such a godsend, it's such a time saver. So those 3 things, and obviously those skills will increase as you progress through your career. But really, if you have those in the beginning, you've got a really strong shot at being successful in any kind of social impact work.
Great,
I'm
thanks, Ken.
going to agree with a ton of what everybody said. And but I'd like to take a longitudinal look. So somebody might be listening to this or tuning in and thinking, maybe I want to transition to this sector, maybe. Or somebody might be thinking, maybe I want to transition later. Or somebody might be thinking, I've made up my mind, I'm intent. All of those are good, I think this pertains. As Matt said, some of the easiest fields in which to transition are the finance function, the investment function, human resources function, communications function, marketing function, operations, and legal function. Now, some of those are going to be more pertinent to larger entities than smaller. It may surprise you to hear me say investment, but if you're a university like Yale, If you're a foundation, if you're a museum, hopefully you have a significant endowment that has to be invested. Another way to think about what I just said is that transferring to the nonprofit sector may be a series of jobs, not just one job. I think sometimes it is harder to do what Ken did, to become the executive director or CEO immediately. If you have a job in one of those functional areas in a nonprofit, getting your next job or the leadership job in a nonprofit is certainly going to be easy. In addition, in most of the fields that I mentioned, in fact, all of them, I think, there are bridge jobs, bridge careers. You can work for instance, Bridgespan, a consulting firm that serves only nonprofits. There are law firms that focus on nonprofits, accounting firms or departments that focus on nonprofits. That's also a great transitional scheme.
Another, just a riff on that, Marilyn, is, obviously there are a lot of CSR departments, corporate social responsibility departments in private sector firms. You have a lot of B Corps now. Maybe the most famous is Patagonia, that are mission-driven for-profits. So there are many ways to have social impact without necessarily having to work for a 501c3.
This is great. Marilyn, can you tell the story about, could you go in a little bit, what are some of the things and how you helped recruit for nonprofits or foundations, people out of the private sector?
Sure. There was a foundation that had a consulting entity within it and wanted only people from one of 3 for-profit consulting firms. So that was a case of going to people in those 3 non-for-profit consulting firms and saying basically, how would you like a pay cut? And in reality, there are people, and just to differ with Matt a tiny bit, and they're sometimes not super early career or super late career, who are looking to make a transition, sometimes for lifestyle reasons, after something like management consulting, where they might have been traveling 4 days a week or more, and they were willing to make the trade-off in compensation. So we had an exact example of someone who went from McKinsey to that foundation. Similarly, I had nothing to do with this, but let me mention this example. There's a person who graduated from Yale and had a long-term career in what we would all call publishing, books, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, she was very active in fundraising for Yale. And serious fundraising, like chair of a class committee, very significant. And she wended her way into development roles and is a significant, chief development officer. So it sounds like I'm doing a commercial for Yale, but really fundraising in a significant way for your class, for a school a child of yours attends, that counts a great deal because that's a lot of work and it shows you understand a big part of a nonprofit situation.
Yeah, I know we can do a plug here we do this at every program, it seems, if you want to get involved and start building up your volunteer capacities and some other skills. Schools, Yale, your college, your graduate school, whatever, is a great way to start to build some of those skills and learn at least fundraising and some of the team building stuff if you hadn't already worked on that a little bit. And YANA, we're always looking for volunteers. So let's talk a little bit more specific. We've got some questions about kind of the nitty gritty about advice for transitioning. We talked a little bit about the early versus late and some of the ageism, maybe one way or the other. And the other question people often have is, how do you find these jobs? If you're not already kind of aligned with a particular nonprofit, for me, when I started, I had no idea. I'm I don't even know if I want to do homelessness. It took me a long time to figure out where I wanted to be. And quite frankly, I like being at the hub of a lot of things. Some people may be more aligned with homelessness or housing or something like that. So how do people find these jobs? How do they network? And then what are the kinds of, what's some advice you would give them? Marilyn, I'm happy to stay, and then we'll turn it over to the others.
I'm happy to kick it off, and I'm sure Matt and Ken have lots to add. You're right, Rachel. Finding out about these jobs is very challenging and fairly decentralized. I compare it to if you're getting out of college and you're going a traditional route and there's the career planning office. It's like stepping on an escalator. You step on, it will take you exactly where you want to go. You probably don't have to think much or do anything like that. This is completely different. You do have to network. I suggest networking with board members, actually. You do want to talk to headhunters, and you might say, well, what headhunters work with nonprofits? And You'd be surprised. I learn about a new one every day. And even if you Google nonprofits executive search, you'll find a number of firms. And then when you talk to board members and staff members of nonprofit, you ask them what search firms they've used or what search firms their organization has used and that kind of thing. You can read the listings. Almost every nonprofit lists available jobs on its website to give you an interesting idea. And also there are omnibus websites like Indeed and even LinkedIn that list a number of things. But in all honesty, it's going to take all three of those approaches: listings, networking, and search firms.
Yeah, I would just add specifically on the networking, if you have causes you're passionate about, look for those organizations and read the bios of the people who are already there. And when you find people who clearly in their bio have made this transition, that's someone that it's going to be interesting to talk to and get advice from, regardless of whether they have a position for you, appoint you to a position. That's going to be how you learn about the sector. And I think that's important too, right? Is learning about your sector. If what you're interested in is the environment, focus on those organizations, get to know people in those organizations, donate if you can, and experience them from that perspective, so that you're not coming in blind when it comes time to get serious about a role for yourself.
Yeah.
And what about you?
Yeah, just add to that. It's a lot of it is just research, a lot of reading, a ton of reading. Marilyn, I remember a few years ago, Marilyn was gracious enough to share with me this incredible Word document that she compiled. It must have been 50 to 100 executive search firms in nonprofit. And as she said, about 80% of them actually listed current searches. Just a wonderful way to get background, to see what's out there. Idealist.org is another, in which you can go in, you can do it, you can sort it by position, you can sort it by salary level, you can sort it geographically. Bridgespan also has a job sort function along those same parameters. So there are a lot of tools out there. It does take time. It can be a grind, but as Matt says, it's only really going to work if you can establish a personal connection and introduction. To go in and to apply cold, it's going to be tough. I mean, let's face it. But if you can have any kind, even a lukewarm introduction into an organization for that interviewer, to get an interviewer, to get someone to listen to you, huge, huge advantage.
Have you ever seen that people have been able to transition from a kind of on the ground volunteer, whether it's soup kitchens or tutoring or something like that, into a hired position, or a board into a hired position? I know we've got people maybe at the end of very long, very prestigious careers, and maybe the boards, but maybe they don't really want to be on a board. They'd rather actually be hands-on. Have you seen any of those kinds of transitions, any of you?
Well, I have, certainly from the board side. I used to joke that sometimes being on the board search committee for the next executive director or CEO was the shortcut to getting the job, because it's happened, time and time again. So you're a known quantity, of course, and the organization. It's not as foolish as it seems. Then too, I have seen people, now this probably only works if you're leaving one job or between jobs, who go in deliberately to be an interim someplace, interim director of development, interim CFO, interim executive director. That's a credential, and they sometimes get the job, as a matter of fact. From volunteering, I have heard of it, I have seen it, but not as much recently as in the past. I think that was for one time the only way in. I don't think that's necessarily true. I also would wonder, and I know we had someone who questioned this, I don't think if you've been in a significant position in the private sector, and if you're in the fortunate position where money really doesn't matter, and you want to take any salary, I don't think that is a good way to go in, because I think senior people are only credible in somewhat senior roles. They are not credible, nor are they going to be happy necessarily or satisfied in a very junior role just because they don't care about the pay.
Can you say something about some of these interims? I know there's some organizations, at least in New York, that are there to do interim CEO in our positions and actually provide lots of training for that. Or do you know how many of those are around, or any of you guys seen them?
I do know. I think it's a booming area. I believe Ken may know more. It's a support center for nonprofits. And I believe it is a 2-day course. And I suspect they're still offering it virtually, so one could probably take it from anywhere. And the support center will also then do something of a placement function when they hear about interims. Another way to do that is to find out who are some sought after interims. And an interim assignment, is usually 3 to 6 months, something like that. So they're going to get calls when they can't take an assignment. So they have to refer people. So I usually tell people, call Margot Amgott, call Richard Burns. They're going to be busy in another assignment, but they may hear of some. So that's my 2 cents, but I welcome other people's 2 cents.
Yeah, I was just going to say what you said, Marilyn. I know that there are a couple of YANA members that have successfully used that support center to land interim jobs, which then transition into full-time work. So it does happen.
And I know in the legal sector, it used to be that way because one way to make the transition was start to do pro bono services for an organization and get really good. That being said, everybody who wants to go be a legal aid lawyer, they don't have to train people costs time and money. So also to be realistic about that, if you think you're going to go, it was like when the chefs and everybody working in restaurants was very popular. We think like, oh, well, I want to go work with whoever it is. It's like, no, they have to train you. You don't know how to chop properly. It's the same thing. You can't just sort of show up and expect because you're going to work for free that people are going to want you. Ken, there was a specific question that came in about kind of having to find the jobs, but particularly how do you find those kind of organizations that are specifically looking or open to looking at private sector folks? You happened on it, but is there any other way you've seen or Matt, any of the clients you've worked with who are particularly looking for some skills and maybe it's just a matter of what's going on in the economy?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I don't know of any systematic way to look at that and to isolate those kinds of opportunities. I just think, as Matt said, just a lot of networking. You have to, you never know when one conversation can be transformational. So you just always have to be open. I also tell people that, don't be bashful about asking people for coffee, for Zoom time. People people want to help, okay? But if you get someone that is willing to help, make sure you don't waste their time. Come prepared, have your questions, be on time, do your part, and the other person, and then follow up. And then, if you say, follow up with a thank you note or an email, and just keep that conversation alive all the time. Especially with a lot of the young students or young alums in the Yale network, they've just been terrific at reaching out. And then again, doing their part of doing the research, being prepared when we have that meeting, and then afterwards, showing that they're still really focused in their own search.
Yeah, I would definitely second and third that as far as doing your research, understanding the organizations, doing your homework. Matt, you had said doing a ton of informational interviewing, and through YANA, and I always say this, seriously, like we have 8,000 people in our network, and that's only the people on our email list. Each one of us has tons of other networks. So if you're ever looking for something, whether it's information or you want to know the insides or about something, like chances are, if I don't know one, Ken, Matt, Marilyn, or someone on our board, everybody will say yes to giving you some time. It helps if you can sort of say specifically, I'm looking to do this. Can you tell me some advice? Or do you know anybody's at this particular firm? I always, Matt, you had mentioned this too, is like I go to every single organization and look at every single staff person and find anybody from Yale. Like that's your best. No Yaley will ever say no if you reach out to them with a very specific. And it's the same thing, I'm sure, for whether you went to Yale undergrad or somewhere else or your graduate school, like a common ground of similarity. That's a great way to start, and people will respond to that. So let's start to wrap it a little bit with some advice and takeaways and stuff. Matt, let's start with you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to what Ken said about finding these positions. It helps to look at an organization's Form 990, their tax form they file. You can find those on GuideStar and other places that you can scroll through, and you can see in certain cases their executive compensation. You can also see things like whether they're spending a significant amount of money on outside firms for, marketing, event help, fundraising services, those sorts of things. And I say to look for those because I think there is a correlation between a larger nonprofit, a more professional nonprofit, that's paying decent salaries to its leaders and is often consulting help from the private sector in the form of contractors or other services, that's going to correlate to some degree with a willingness to look at your application, learn about you as someone coming from the private sector. I think and there's high variance in the nonprofit sphere on this, right? Do they take compensation seriously? That's a whole can of worms, but you can see in those tax filings some of those things that might make you more or less interested in a particular organization. But my one piece of advice, as Yale alumni here, people on this call, is that I think if you make this transition and if you end up in the nonprofit sphere, one thing you always want to be aware of is the kind of power imbalances and privilege that you can bring to the table if you are someone who made their money in another time and place in the for-profit sector in some way, and compensation doesn't matter to you that much at the end of the day, and you have a freedom that a lot of the staff members you might be overseeing do not, right? And I think this is one of the #1 things that can go wrong when people are not conscious of this, and how one of the best things you can do as a nonprofit leader is not just being an advocate for the people that your programs are serving, but being an advocate for the people who are your fellow staff members at that organization. And that's actually one of the big things you can bring from the for-profit sector is, hey, look, if we don't pay people decent market rates for the skills that they have and the things that they do, we're going to lose talent. And the people we serve in whatever our mission is are going to suffer. And as someone coming from a for-profit sector, you can bring that message in a way that even those staff members who've been there for 15 years probably can't. And if you can make yourself an advocate for those staff members, I think that really lifts up a lot of organizations. It's one of the best things you can do.
So some great points. Thank you, Matt. Ken, you want to chime in with some advice?
Matt beautifully said, at my current nonprofit now, NYPACE, we're fighting for a bigger benefits package for healthcare, for personal time off, paternity leave. Just all these things that are more and more common on the for-profit side. Why shouldn't the nonprofit have equal type benefits and standard of living? Absolutely right. The other thing is, I think the word came out early on, and that is approaching nonprofit with a sense of humility. You're not the big for-profit know-it-all guy or person. You don't know anything when you walk in that door. You have to learn. And with a sense of humility, the whole notion of what they call servant leadership, it's not, you have to check your ego at the door. It's not about tops down, showing how people, as I always say, it's not about, people don't want to care how much you know, they want to know how much you care. And you really have to totally emphasize your people skills to the extent you have them. And I'm sensing that if you're looking to join nonprofit, you probably have a good amount of those. But it really is about people.
That's great. Thanks, Ken. Marilyn, you want to kind of take us home? And you've always got a great list of.
Sure. I think my fellow panelists have hinted at this, but loving the mission is not enough. Caring about the mission should be coupled with an actual skill set and actual need for the skills that you have. We find people who say, oh, this hospital changed my life. I want to work there. I'll do anything. Well, that's not a very realistic or specific way of going into a situation.
Okay. Good. Anyone else that would want to wrap up? I do want to tell our audience, if you've got any last minute questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, or you can send me an email later. We have a lot of very generous board members and people in our network who will spend time. And I'm glad to see in this day and age when a lot of things have gone online, but even Yale has been doing a lot for students. I had lots of career coffee chats and things, and there seems to be, as Ken, I think you're saying, there's been a growing interest, I think, in this sort of mission-driven space. And I hope all of our panelists and everyone out there who has some time will be willing to share it one-on-one if needed. That's the beauty of our network. Any last minute thoughts for everyone before we wrap up here? think we've covered everything. I want to thank everyone for registering and for joining us. We have 2 more programs that we know coming up. The next one is going to be probably in August, is going to be about avoiding burnout. So for those of you folks who are sort of like in the middle, and that's also for oneself, who are often on the front lines, but also for staff management. How are they dealing with, as you said, advocating for them and some issues they need dealing with. And we're going to have people from a variety of sectors who work in those fields and have been advocating and engaged in some other areas. And then we're going to be working on a really interesting one on the third age, is what it's called, the sort of 65 and older careers. I know people have questions like, what do I do now? I've had this great successful career, I've been working 100 hours a week. Now what? How do I figure out how to give back? And what are some ways you can do that besides just writing a check? And we're going to kind of really delve into some of the psychology of that, what works, how to find meaning, and some practical ways to do that. So hopefully you'll stay on our email list and join us for some future programs. As always, if you like any of the stuff we're doing, we do this like a public radio station. We provide these services for free. If you want to help support us, that'd be great. Just go to our website and support YANA button. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you to Matt, to Ken, and Marilyn for joining us and sharing your wisdom. We'll see you all at the next program. Thanks very much.
Thank you.